New and used car prices are simply just unaffordable. And yet a lot of people are still buying cars. We've seen major changes in overall inventory levels. We're seeing used cars absolutely down. Inventory levels are dropped. And we're pulling up some statistics here. Let's take a quick look here. I want to talk about this because all week I was showing you guys what's going on in the industry, what's going on at Ford, GM, and in general, the cost of living crisis is taking a toll on people. Less people are able to afford a brand new car, and that's pushing a lot of people into the used car space because that feels like the only way out. But the unfortunate part is what's happening with used cars. There are a lot of those cars now are going up in value, not necessarily value, a perceived value. Supply and demand is kicking into high gear, forcing people to make a decision to go something slightly used. Now, where people think they can get a great deal on a late model, quality, low mileage used vehicle, for example, a 1-2-year-old vehicle, that's not really the place where you're going to save a lot of money. As a matter of fact, people have often asked, is it better to buy a new vehicle than a 1 or 2-year-old vehicle that has some warranty on it, has low mileage? And I'd say 9 times out of 10 right now is actually better to buy a new vehicle if you can afford it than it is to buy that slightly used, low mileage used vehicle. Of course, because that used vehicle now subject to, lending rates that are associated with just standard bank loans, standard terms. We know interest rates, lending rates are quite high right now. Still, we're seeing it's kind of leveled, but it's not really dropping. And the banks, the reserves and the banks of Canada aren't necessarily, passing any of that down to the consumer. And so what you're finding is, you're buying that slightly used car at a slight discount, but by the time you incorporate lending rates, you're probably going to pay more. And now you've got a used vehicle that's, potentially worth less. And so if you're going to buy a used car, it's that 5-year, 3, 4, 5-year and beyond. It's those vehicles that aren't, the $45,000 vehicle. We're looking at the $18,000 to $20,000 vehicle where you're going to get your bang for buck. But unfortunately now you're paying a higher price for that vehicle. You're getting what I'd consider a less of a bang for buck, although it's more affordable. You're not getting quite the same deal because that's where everybody is trying to get into. Everybody's trying to get that 6-year-old vehicle that's not beat up, that maybe hasn't had accident history. And that's what people are trying to get their hands on because they can't afford a lot of these new vehicles. But let's pull up some statistics here. And I want to share with you because Cox Automotive does a great way to summarize this. And what they're saying is currently there's about 2 million or 2.08 million unsold used vehicles as of July 8th of 24. And, interestingly enough, because that's actually down since about a month before, month over month, they're down from about 2.25 million units, and that was at the start of June. Now, with that said, it's about the same as it was about a year earlier. We're seeing the natural ebbs and flows, of course, with the market changes as we go through the different seasonal changes, as we typically see a rush after tax time, and then, of course, that leveling off, and there's less popularity. And then, of course, we had the DMS, that digital management system failure, where the hackers got in. So that's skewing some of the numbers. But generally, statistically, it's looking like we're still in a very stable environment for used car sales. People are still buying, and there's still about 2 million units available. And with that said, at the current rate of sales, there's about a 53-day supply. So there's still almost 2 months of supply out there, still floating around potentially. A lot of vehicles are just less desirable, less wanted. But if you need a vehicle, there's still a lot of selection out there. The average listing price, though, and I want to kind of talk about, is still about $25,251. And this is interesting because when we pull up a chart here by Cox, we look at what's happened over the years, the course of the last few years in the used car sector. And we know what happened in 2021. So 2020 is when all crap hit the fan. But then things were weird and unstable, and then the government started handing money out. And then it kind of forced people to start rethink my career, my car, my mortgage, all these things. And then it wasn't until about April of 2021 that we start to see this big upswing. And a lot of that had to do with interest rates, how they changed. And we can see that back in 21, how we saw April and it all of a sudden start to climb. So the average transaction price of used cars start to go up because used were going up. It was harder to get new vehicles because of the chip shortages. So people were going to the used segments, and that, of course, supply and demand drove prices up. Well, that drove prices to the point where it sort of crossed that nodal point, the average, October, November, and all of a sudden in 2021, we exceeded new numbers that we hadn't seen in pretty much forever. And then we roll into 2022, and we saw numbers that were, averaging up and down, in that $27,000, $28,000 average transaction price. Then in 23, they dropped a little bit further. And all of this is on the back of the fact that more and slowly more and more new cars became available, less and less popularity in getting sort of what I'd consider junk, quite honestly. Junky used cars. There's a lot of cars that were probably shouldn't even have been on the market. I showed you in previous videos, honestly. I took you out to car lots where the quality of the used vehicles weren't there. There's lots that were coming out of the woodwork. They were putting lipstick on a pig, pardon the pun, but quite honestly, a lot of dealers were just painting up an old piece of junk that honestly previously would never have made it to a dealer, lot. Just the quality wasn't there. There was, damage history. There was flood history. Maybe they were just too banged up where now the dealers were willing to spend a few dollars on, sort of not restoring it, but making it look, saleable. And so there was a lot of these sort of creative marketing, if you will, by the dealers to, do a little extra detailing, a little extra touch-up paint, deeper clean on the seats. And there were some shady practices in there too, but it essentially drove prices up because it was harder to get those used vehicles. But we saw that in 2023, 2022, that was happening. But that started to curtail and that start to drop as inventory levels of brand new vehicles start to rise. And so now we're at a point where we're seeing this natural, very slow natural decline in overall average transaction prices. And now, if you look at it, we've actually finally dropped to a number where we haven't seen since June of 2021. We're actually dropping. It's been dropping year over year slightly every single year for the average transaction price of used vehicles. Now we're at $25,251 based on Cox Automotive statistics. And so, clearly it's still too high. It's still way too high. We bought a good quality used car for our daughter. It's a 2012 Honda Civic. We just drove it back. We just actually got back from California, and it's proven right there that 100,000 miles on a 10 or 12-year-old Honda Civic, and we drove all the way through the Sierra Nevadas. We drove through California. We drove through the Mojave Desert. We drove all the way down to Vegas, Los Angeles. Drove all over the cities. Did all the the typical sites, and then we drove all the way back. And the Honda Civic didn't miss a beat. So you don't need to buy that new car. And as a matter of fact, I'm hearing tons of stories of people buying brand new Rams, brand new cars and trucks. We know Hondas and their 1.5s, oil and fuel dilution. CVTs are something in the last 10 years more popular, not as reliable. Cars are not as reliable today. There's a lot of technology. There's a lot of performance, turbocharged engines. Our car is a little naturally aspirated engine. Cars are not as reliable today. They perform well, but they're not as dependable. When they break, they're harder to fix. So I proved out the fact that an older 10 or 12-year-old Honda is still as reliable. We drove it 5,000 kilometers, 3,000 miles round trip. And you don't need to get that new vehicle to get reliability. But as a result, the average transaction price now for used vehicles down to $25,251. We only paid 12 grand for our Honda in Canadian dollars, and honestly, that's probably about $8,000 US, $9,000 US. So we got a great deal, and there are some great deals out there. So that's in fact what's causing this market now to shift. Is we're starting to see just gradual decline in value. Now, with all of that said, of course, we're seeing the average mileage of these vehicles are about 70,000 miles. So when we're talking about used car transactions, people seem to be unloading them at that 50, 60, 70, 80,000 mile range when essentially warranty's up. And, that sort of clearly tells the story to me. A lot of people are scared of not having a warranty. And so, most warranties are, in that range. And so people don't want to hold on to it. But you know what? That's where I thrive typically, is buying used cars. I mean, even look at my old Ram. I've showed you that time and time again. It's a 2003, and I just kind of keep on keeping on and put new tires, new brakes, and just kind of keep it going. And it's doing me just fine. So somebody's got to buy new cars, but it's probably not going to be me anytime soon. I love the value. I love the exercise of going out and shopping and comparing a few different versions of the same car that's on the used car market, looking at different conditions and reviewing service records. And I love that. To me, it's a bit of a challenge. And then looking for something like that, it always just is a little intriguing for me. So it's a bit of the hunt, if you will. So what we're seeing is this used car inventory is decreasing. So there's less of them on the market. The average transaction price is going down. The mileage is still kind of hovering. So there's options to buy used vehicles, and they've always been popular. But a lot of people are just going that route, and they're just looking for older used cars. Now, what's going on in the new car sector, and I think this is pretty telling to me. As I was showing you this week, what's going on, I showed you some Nissan products earlier in the week and talked about cost of living, GDP. People are mortgaged, credited up to the hilt. They can't afford a lot of this stuff. People are spending, but it doesn't mean they're spending money that they have. And we know that's becoming a real problem. And once the creditors figure out, we can't lend you any more money, you're tapped out, there's going to be a point here where this is it. And there's going to be some hard, sharp adjustments coming up, I believe. But for now, what we're seeing are really high prices. With that said, this has been an interesting time with some big incentives on new vehicles. We're starting to see the motivation to buy new. And as I said before, as opposed to buying a 2-year-old used, you're probably better off buying a brand new vehicle, because now you're subject to all the big incentives. You're going to get buybacks, cashbacks, better finance rates. Now, with that said, there's a bit of a myth here, and a lot of you probably aware of this, but I'm going to share it anyway. You walk in and a dealer's advertising, this cash price or 0% financing, and you think, well, I'll take both. That's not going to happen because that 0% finance is offset by the increased cost of that cash price of that vehicle. So it's one or the other. It's just another marketing scheme or scam to get you in the door and get you looking at it. But honestly, you're not getting any great deal. The bottom line is the bottom line. So if you're going to get a 0%, you're going to pay a lot more money for the cash price of that vehicle, and vice versa. If you're getting good, you're going to sharpen your pencils, get an absolute aggressive cash price for that vehicle. You're probably not going to get that 0% if you decide to all of a sudden finance. You can negotiate towards that, but you're probably not going to see that. Now, what we're seeing is new vehicle affordability is declining, and declining in a better way, I guess I would say. The numbers are dropping down. And what we've seen, if you look at this graph here, not a big shocker. Same thing we saw in probably February, March of 21, April. We're seeing the average number of weeks that it takes to pay off your vehicle start to climb drastically. And so this is the income needed to purchase a new light vehicle. And so the amount of weeks that people are investing to pay their vehicle off has been changing, and we see this since back, we look in the sort of the spring of 21 is when we started to see the climb upwards in terms of the amount of weeks it took, or the buying power was reduced to get into that new vehicle. And we saw that climb, and a lot of it had to do with the escalation in prices, the shortage of vehicles, the supply and demand forced vehicle prices up, and people didn't have the money, wages didn't quite catch up, and it took people a little bit longer to pay off their vehicles. So, we peaked probably in that, the end of 22, where we seen it was close to 40 weeks of your salary to actually pay off that vehicle. Since then, we've seen this very ever so slight decrease to the point where in June of 24 here, we're now down to 37.2 weeks of salary to pay off your average vehicle. And, with that said, before all of this schmoz began, this was back, we look at, kind of the pre-pandemic, if you will, the 19, so 2019 and 20, it was down around 32 weeks. So it's taking 5 weeks, you know, an extra month, couple months to pay off these vehicles. It's not any drastic, sharp changes, but we are seeing the trending downwards, and that's a clear indication that the incentives are starting to kick in. And where we're seeing this a sharp decrease is sort of the end of 23. And we talked about this. You know, everybody talked about the bubble bursting. And that's kind of around that time because people stopped buying, incentives started to go up, prices started to get readjusted. And we're seeing that sharp change in the end of 23. And it's been dropping ever since. So we're seeing this affordability increase improvements here this year in 2024. Basically, since the end of 23, we're seeing some changes, and what that looks like is, you know, the average, the typical monthly payment has changed. It's increased by about 0.6%. It's gone up to about $756 per month, and quite honestly, it did peak at about $795, and that was, again, I said the end of 22 is when we saw some big numbers. So it did peak close to $800 per month people were paying. And remember, that's the average. We've also talked about we're now about 11% of the car loans currently are over $1,000 a month. I mean, I remember a time when $1,000 a month got you a nice a mortgage payment for quite a substantial home. And now, unfortunately, people are paying that for cars. And when they say, well, it's the second largest investment, I know I often get corrected by a lot of people and say, well, a car's not an investment. It sort of is. Anywhere you put money, apply money to look for some kind of return eventually, it is some sort of an investment. It's not a good investment. And honestly, unless you buy some weird exclusive Ferrari that might turn a profit, most cars are a brutal investment. It's not really, and to the point, a lot of people just don't consider them investments because they just don't hold their value, diminishing returns. And if you keep it long enough, it basically goes to nothing. And so honestly, yeah, investment's a kind of a strong phrase. But quite frankly, we're not seeing any drastic changes. We are seeing inventory levels drop on both new and used. And new is dropping because of all the big incentives, huge incentives that we've been seeing all year because of sales have been poor. A lot of these dealers are, you know, winding up with a lot more inventory on their lots. I mean, just look at Stellantis. They can't even sell the Charger or the Hornets, not selling. You know, a lot of their Jeeps, their little pickup truck Jeeps, aren't selling that well. Their Grand Cherokee's not selling well. Interestingly, the Cherokee, or not the Cherokee, the Wagoneers are actually, interestingly, about the only Jeep that's sort of selling right now, in the Grand Wagoneers. But other than that, Stellantis is suffering a bad one. 2500, 3500 HD trucks, not selling very well. Highly incentivized. Half-ton trucks, highly incentivized. And honestly, it's a combination of overpriced as well as market demands, and they're catering to the wrong clientele. I mean, they're trying to go up market, but people are like, you know, this is a bread and butter. They were always the third option. I mean, if you're looking at a pickup truck, we also looked at the old school trucks. I mean, trucks like the Chevy and the Fords were always number one and number two if you're looking for a truck, and Rams were always sort of that third outlier. And yet they're trying to now currently price themselves higher in a lot of cases, comparable trim levels. And it's a pretty strong indication to me that they're out of touch. Not only that, have you heard this story here? Actually, this week, there's a customer, they bought a 2018 Ram. He bought it brand new in Canada here. And he drove it for a few years, and all of a sudden went and springtime appeared. And all of a sudden there's these flaky chunks of paint and rust. Looks on top of the roof, and there's all kinds of paint flaking off of this truck. And then he goes to the dealers and they try to escalate this problem and you know, try to get some sort of remuneration or some kind of compensation for this problem. And they're basically turning away, say your warranty's done. His whole truck is flaking apart. And stories like this don't bode well, because unfortunately it just adds to the fuel to the fire when people say, like, where's the quality? But you're charging it like there's max quality, but we're not getting it. It's not indicated here. And so people are seeing the writing on the wall with companies like Stellantis, been overcharging for years. The prices are too high, the quality's too low, and now they basically isolated some of their bread and butters, with the V8 engines going away, bringing in this turbo inline six called the Hurricane. It really does feel like they're isolating and they're going down a rabbit hole that not a lot of buyers are looking for. Then we looked at Fords yesterday, and I showed you, now we're talking Canadian prices. We saw a Platinum F-150. Folks, this is a F-150. It's a light-duty truck, and they were trying to sell this thing $107,000. That's, I mean, it absolutely, I'm still shaking my head. I was still shaking after that. When I saw $107,000 for a decked out F-150, it's absolutely mind-blowing to me. XLTs, were up there, $90,000, $80,000. Or, Lariats, sorry, were $80,000, $90,000. XLTs were in that $80,000, $78,000. It's mind-blowing. But even more interesting is a lot of these new vehicles, and I mentioned this in the videos, and I'll give you the links here at the end of the video. If you haven't seen it, I'll attach the links to a couple of those hot videos that I produced this week. But honestly, a lot of it, whether you're talking about GM, General Motors, GMC, Chevy, Fords, it's interesting. The prices are high because these are high trim level vehicles. But I looked at all these lots and I could not for the life of me find any base trim trucks, XLs or, basic, very, very basic Fords or basic Chevy GMs, unless they were fleets. But they were typically ordered in specific for that customer. But you don't see the lots full of available entry-level base half-ton trucks, light-duty pickup trucks. They're just not out there because the profits aren't there, and the dealers and the OEMs, they just know that. And so people are almost like desensitized, and they're overpaying for all of these vehicles. I showed you a Raptor, $125,000, $130,000, a Raptor Bronco. What? I mean, $130,000, you put all your extras and taxes and you're 140 grand plus out the door. It still boggles my mind that people are paying, like, prices are way too high. And sure, while we've seen a slight decline, some of the dropping in prices of new is only because of incentives. The average transaction prices have dropped. Inventory levels have dropped and because of incentives, but the prices are still way too damn high. I mean, we're looking at, getting 5%, 2% off the price of sticker price off of these vehicles when they've jacked them up 40% in the last 3 years. So people recognize that. People aren't stupid. You guys are listening. There's a few of us channels around. Car Questioned Answered. Absolutely. One of the best channels for really recognizing what's going on behind the scenes, what's going on in the market, and bringing it right to the ground level. One of the best, nittiest, grittiest channels that really tells it the way it is. What's going on new, what's going on used. A great channel for that because they tell it. And so some of these channels, like them, like us, are telling what's going on. They're bringing it real. Motor Feed, another one. They're talking about what's going on in this industry. And it's real. Yes, there's lots of incentives and people are still out buying. But there's a lot of people that aren't buying. And price and sales are down. Hence these heavy incentives to try to motivate people. But people aren't dumb. They're either out of credit, out of cash, or just, done with it. Conceptually, out of principle, like myself, I'm not going to go buy a $90,000 truck. It doesn't make sense. When I know for 5 years ago, that same truck listed for, $48,000. Why would I do that? It just doesn't, it goes against my moral compass. And sorry, I'm not above or below, but it just doesn't feel right to me. So until I see something more tangible, I'm not buying a new truck anytime soon. But a lot of you do need them, and a lot of you are in a place where you're ready to buy, so I get it. So that's where don't buy that late model used vehicle. Get either a really old used vehicle that's well looked after, or get yourself a brand new one that happens to be heavily incentivized, but you have to shop around. But we are seeing, inventory slowly drop, and we're seeing some of the used car inventory drop too. So really, the car prices are simply still too high, and people have to buy, and it's a consumer good, of course, and people are buying them. But, I've proven it. The Honda Civic, 12-year-old car, no problem. Model Ram, no problem. driving a lot of these vehicles have a lot more life left in them than a lot of people give them credit for. And the worst part is that the quality of some of these modern day vehicles just sort of aren't where they should be. I think of many years ago, I've always lived by the philosophy of buying a used vehicle. I've always got the best bang for buck. And where some people, it's like what is it? Some people's garbage is other people's jewels or gems. And that's the way I see this. And often people just want the latest and greatest flashy item, and I'm able to usually get another 10 years on top of anything that somebody passed down that was already 3 or 5 years old. So I like buying used cars, got to get huge bang for buck. But I've proven it. There's some great deals out there. If you want a new vehicle, there are still some great deals, and some manufacturers that didn't gouge to the ultimate, to the moon and back during this whole pandemic. And, a couple OEMs that were like that were, the Mazdas, Subarus. I particularly like Mazda. I think they're doing some pretty good things these days. They've got some great drivetrains, simple cars that are relatively affordable. That's a great ICE vehicle. You can get turbo, non-turbos, all kinds of great options there. If you just need a great little runabout, great cars, still affordably priced. I've seen Toyota lately start to play some games, in my opinion. I showed you with a RAV4 Prime, playing that hard to get, charging maximum dollars market adjustment. I'm not having that. That's ridiculous. And also they've upped their price on their recent Camrys. It's supposed to be, garden variety, not economic. It's supposed to be an affordable family car, and yet they're starting to crank up prices there too. We're seeing the Tacoma's getting ludicrous. We're seeing Tundra's getting ludicrous for pricing, and so they're great vehicles. Toyota's had a great reputation, but conversely, they're starting to really price their vehicles up, and it feels like a lot of dealers, OEMs aren't even looking for justification anymore, because the chip shortage is gone. The supply and demand issues are gone. Inventory's back. So what's the excuse now? Okay, we know inflation, but these dealers are charging way beyond standard inflationary numbers. We're just getting gouged as a consumer. So we have to be smarter about this. We have to shop stronger, harder, better negotiation tactics, and quite frankly, again, maybe we elect to get the most life out of our used vehicles. Did you realize 12.7 years is the average age of a vehicle driving down the road today, which is, up from 5 years ago. It was only around 8 years. People are keeping their vehicles longer than they ever have because they clearly see the value in it, and they also can't afford the price of some of these new vehicles. Combination effort with the increased price of sales price of a lot of these vehicles is getting cost prohibitive. Compounded by the fact that inflation's outrun of wages, and naturally, the Bank of Canada and the reserves in the U.S. aren't adjusting lending rates quick enough, and interest rates are a little too high, and so people are keeping their vehicles longer. I'm prime example, and I'm the guy that's going to be the poster child for a good old used vehicle that just keep on trucking. Hone up your DIY skills. Find a good independent shop. Maybe it's a great project to take up with your son, daughter, wife, kid. It doesn't matter. Keep some of these vehicles running, and you'll find it's just, life is a lot more enriching when you don't have that $1,200 a month payment to keep that depreciating asset in the driveway. It's just simply not worth it if you don't have the money. So at the end of the day, I'd love to hear your comments. Do you have a heavy car payment that you'd love to get out of? Do you have any regrets? Possibly, maybe buying a used car would be a better choice. I'd love to hear your story. Please drop a line below. And as well, right there, check it out. Yeah, this week's video is very popular. GM, as well as what's going on at Ford. Absolutely ludicrous with some of the pricing and what the changes that both those organizations have made in recent days. Hope to see each and every one in the next one. We'll see you real soon. Bye.